Joshua chapter 6, verse number 24. And they burnt the city with fire, and all that was therein, only the silver and the gold and the vessels of brass and of iron they put into the treasury of the house of the Lord. What did they do with that? They put all of that stuff in the treasury of the house of the Lord. And Joshua saved Rahab the harlot alive, and her father's household, and all that she had. And she dwelleth in Israel even unto this day, because she hid the messengers which Joshua sent to spy out Jericho. And Joshua adjured them at that time, saying, Cursed be the man before the Lord that riseth up and buildeth this city Jericho. He shall lay the foundation thereof in his firstborn, and in his youngest son shall he set up the gate of it. So the Lord was with Joshua, and his fame was noised throughout all the country. This morning, I want to talk to you particularly from the pivotal verse, verse number 26, where it says, And Joshua adjured them at that time, saying, Cursed be the man before the Lord that riseth up and buildeth this city Jericho. He shall lay the foundation thereof in his firstborn, and in his youngest son shall he set up the gates of it. And from that, I want you to turn to your neighbor on both sides of you and say, Leave Jericho alone. Yeah, that should have happened twice if I asked to turn to the neighbor on both sides of you. So let's do that again for the makeup test, okay? Turn to both neighbors and say, Leave Jericho alone. Thank you, people of God. Thank you, people of God. Thank you, people of God. One of the things I like to stress as an educator, I don't deem myself to just be a preacher. I deem myself to be an educator of the Word of God, because preaching happens a dime a dozen. Preaching is impressive. Education is informative. It's inspirational. One of the things I stress to myself in my process of studying is not to assume that the people of God know the story. I don't want to assume that you know the story. There are many people that miss the message because the preacher assumed that people knew the story. And so pardon me if I sound a little elementary this morning, or fundamental, or basic, but I don't want to make the dangerous assumption that you know the story for the sake of you not missing the message. And so we really, in order to get the gist of this passage that we read, have to understand it in its context. And I want to drive that word in you. Everybody say context. Context. Context has to do with the situation leading up, the situation after, what it's all about. You cannot draw a conclusion from the middle of a story. And so it's important to understand everything that happened that came up to this. It won't be long, but some of the stuff you may be familiar with. You remember Israel was in what kind of bondage? Egyptian bondage. God sent Moses into Egypt to tell Pharaoh to what? Let my people go. Many of you are familiar with that. Well, he goes in there, Moses, and God sends the plagues, and they come out of Egypt, and they're going through the Red Sea. They come across the Red Sea, and guess what they were stuck with after the Red Sea? They were stuck wandering around in the wilderness. What were they doing? Wandering around in the wilderness. They did this for 40 years. They wandered around in the wilderness for 40 years. They were no longer slaves, but they were not completely free. The wilderness was not the freedom that they were going to experience. The wilderness was not the freedom that they were promised. What they were promised by Moses by God through Moses is that I'm going to take you to a land that floweth with milk and honey, a good land, a fruitful land, a land that you can call your own. They were en route to the land called Canaan. Where were they going? Canaan. The wilderness was not their destination. It was their in-between. But like many of us who get impatient with where God is taking us, like many of us that get tired of being where we are and not being where we want to be, like many of us that lose our sense of contentment, some of them got fed up with not being where they wanted to be, not being where God promised they would be, so they began to make where they were like where they wanted to be. It's dangerous to pull a pillow up to a park bench. It's dangerous to try to be comfortable in a naturally uncomfortable place. It's a dangerous thing to try to settle where God is moving you from. And the children of Israel did this, and it was never God's original design for them to walk around in this wilderness for 40 years, but they were disobedient. And so they marched around, moved from place to place in this vast wilderness for 40 years, and many of them died in the wilderness. Many of them died on the way. Many of them died before they got to the promise. Many of them died at the place that was the holding place for them getting the promise. Many of them died in between. Let me just say this, drop this nugget along the way. A lot of us, we need to be careful of impatience. Because a lot of us think we're there. When we're not there, we're just in between. But we'd rather consider ourselves to have arrived since we're not where we want to be, so that we don't feel so bad about where we are. But the truth of the matter is, you ain't seen nothing yet if you hold the line. You're just in your wilderness. Well, the children of Israel, some of them died. And quite naturally, another generation came up. And even Moses died. Moses died. God let him see the promised land, but then he died. And the reason why he didn't go into the promised land is there was one time where Moses gets frustrated. The people are getting on his nerves, and God said, speak. They get thirsty, and God says, speak to the rock. And Moses gets frustrated, and he hits the rock, and water comes out the rock. But before he hits the rock, he says, must we fetch you water out of this rock? He forgot that he wasn't doing anything. He forgot that it wasn't his power. He forgot that Israel were not his people. And every man of God, every leader of God, every elder, every bishop, every deacon, every ministry leader need to remember that these ain't your people. You're not my people. You are the people of God. And you hear me saying that, people of God. You belong to God, and God can do whatever he wants with his instrument. And Moses forgot that. So he gets mad. Must we fetch you water out of this rock? And he hit the rock. And God said, because of that, I'm going to let you see where you could have gone. But you're going to be buried right here in this mountain. So Moses dies. Y'all with me? But before he died, there was a young man with Moses, following his every move. He was one of the original ones that came out of Egypt. There were only two, and he was one of the original ones. There was a young man that listened to Moses and watched Moses and saw Moses in his ups and in his downs and in his dealings with God, who watched Moses, and that young man's name was Joshua. And when Moses died, God tells Joshua, it's time for you to take the children of Israel where Moses was taking them. He said, don't worry about trying to be like Moses. Moses, my servant, is dead. It's your time now. So just thus is born or birthed the book that we call Joshua. Joshua is the book of Israel's history as they left the wilderness into the promised land. Well, the promised land was there. It was there for the taking, but the problem was it was inhabited. How many of you know that? There were people living there already. And for years, I know there's some people that for years thought that when they go into the promised land, they just go and they just enjoy it. There were people living there already. And these people living there did not like the idea that this group of people who came out of Egypt was going to come there, inhabit the land, and call the land theirs. They didn't like that. As a matter of fact, they were prepping themselves to fight. They had heard about what happened to them. They had heard about this large group of people that walked through the Red Sea on dry land. They heard about the God that opened up the waters of the Red Sea. They heard about the God that put the plagues on Egypt. These people heard about that in the Canaan Daily News, if you would, as it was happening in Egypt. And they were putting up a resistance. And the first place that Israel came to when they leave the wilderness is a city called Jericho. If you look in Joshua chapter 6 and verse number 1, as they come to Jericho, one of the particularities about Jericho is that Jericho was a very protected city. They couldn't get in there. As a matter of fact, Jericho represented Israel not having what God had given them. Canaan was their possession. But the first city they get to is locked up. What do you do when what God has for you is on lockdown? So here Israel is, thousands and thousands of Israelites, thousands of Israelites. They're marching in and they get to this city, and the city has walls that are yea so high, walls that are yea so thick, and they're standing there, and Joshua is leading them, and he gets to this place. They finally made it to the promised land. They survived the wilderness. They watched their loved ones die. They watched God feed them water and give them sweet waters. They've been eating so long on manna, and now they're finally at the place where their diet can change. They're finally at the place where they get what God promised. They're finally at the place where God has delivered them. They're finally out of the wilderness. Now they can eat some pomegranates and some fruit and some vegetables, and they can get a new diet. They can worship their own God, and they get to Canaan, and they get to the city of Jericho, and what God says was going to be theirs is a lockdown. So God, he tells Joshua, he says, this is what I want you to do. I want you to march around the city one time each day. And then on the seventh day, I want you to march around 7 times. Just march around the city, which I thought was awesome. Because when what God has for you is on lockdown, you need to march around it and praise God while you do. Stay around it. You didn't hear me this morning. When what God has for you seems to be on lockdown, stay around it. Stay around it, because if God has it for you, it does not matter how locked down it is. At some point, no matter how locked down it is, it's going to be yours. Some of us get anxious and we God has this for me, and we really believe it until we get there and it's on lockdown. Stay around it. If that's the job God has for you, stay around it. Call the folk on the job. Call the boss and call the supervisor and say, well, there's any openings yet? If it's yours, just start marching around it, and you better believe that the walls are going to come tumbling down. That's how some of you got married. She was on lockdown.